Hi, in this video demonstration, we're going to go ahead and take a look at one of the tools in 3D Studio Max called Render to Texture. In an earlier lesson, we built a crate and some textures for a crate so that each side of the box was different using multi-sub-object shaders here. What I have is just the finished result of that with 5 different subtextures of standard origin here. Let me switch over to mental ray to be sure we're all on the same page. And this nice crate modeled and textured out, looking nice. Now, a lot of times, especially if we're working with things like video games and we're going to be exporting our 3D artwork to a game engine of sorts, multi-sub-object texture shaders, which exist in 3D Studio, don't always exist in other software that you're going to be working with as well. Things like Unity or Unreal Editors and stuff like that that don't have quite as many shaders as 3D Studio does, which is built for everything animation and not just games. And we need to get a flattened image out. In one of the other tutorials in this module, you took a look at how to texture this crate initially using the Uvw Unwrapped Editor. In this one, we're going to take a look at taking all the hard work we did with the multi-sub-object shaders and turning that into a single flat image texture, which can then be exported out from 3D Studio and into any other game engine that uses that unwrap style texturing. What we have here is our crate. It's textured just like we did in the multi-sub-object shader lesson. With a multi-sub-object shader with 5 different sub-material types. Over on the Modify tab, you'll see that the box itself, or the crate itself, is an editable poly with a standard box Uvw Map modifier on it. Now, in order to do this and take all these 5 separate textures and all of their information and sort of render them out or flatten them out into a single image worth of data, we are going to have to use that Uvw Unwrap Editor, which is kind of why we introduced you to that here before we got into this one. So right on top of everything else, we're going to leave that Uvw Map modifier, the standard one that works great for our box as is, right where it's at. But we're going to go ahead and up to the modifier list here, scroll down to close to the bottom, and add that Unwrap UVWs on the very, very, very top. Now, this being on top is going to overall negate the underneath effects here in the future. Everything that's on top is going to be the last thing loaded. So your Uvw maps are still there. They still exist. And then on top of it, we've put this kind of a blank slate up here. What I want to do with this is because this first Uvw map, if I go ahead back down to it, has a map channel set to 1 in here. The Uvw Map Unwrap modifier here has also got a map channel, and we want to give that a different number so that those aren't getting confused and talking to each other in the wrong direction. I'll just change this one to 2 and hit enter, and a warning will show up. It says this modifier contains only 1 Uvw channel, and you've chosen a new one. Would you like to move the UVs from the current channel to the chosen channel or abandon? Just go ahead and say move. What they're going to do then is apply all of the original work basically to this second map channel as well. Inside, let's go ahead and open up the Uvw Editor here. And inside this thing, we can see our polygons for this polygon modeled crate. I'm going to go ahead and select the polygon sub-object selector. And then even the element, select by element UV toggle. And I'm just going to try and get everything from this crate here selected. You may need to come back up to the top and unselect your ignore backfacing in order to successfully get all of these polygons here. And right now, as they're all stacked on top of each other, what we want to do is just quickly and easily as possible flatten them out and separate each piece into some different images and that aren't overlapping each other. We're going to do that by doing the good old-fashioned up to the mapping menu, select Flatten Mapping, and then let's just go ahead and leave everything default in here and say OK. It should reorganize and repack your crate separating a whole lot of both little and larger pieces out into this thing. Now, if we're doing this as a real professional job, we would probably spend some time making sure that certain pieces are in certain places, as well as the size is a little bit better. It does a pretty good job keeping the size correct, as well as making some of these little pieces maybe larger in the long run. But for this demonstration, this is going to be good enough. Now that we've flattened everything out, we can go ahead and leave the UV editor and turn off that sub-object selection. And now we can talk about what this video demonstration is truly about, which is our render to texture window. Now that we've gotten a unwrap modifier set up for our crate, in other words, we've got UVs that are completely flattened out and separated from each other, we can render all 5 of these subtextures that we used in our multi-sub-object texturing, which include things like specularity channels and bump maps, etc. And we can go ahead and render them into a single flat image, which we can then use in something like a game engine. Where to do this? Now that our Unwrap Uvw modifier is on there and everything, we can come up to our render menu and find render to texture. The hotkey for this is 0. So if you want to start learning how to save some time and look like a real professional, you'll go ahead and hit 0 to open up our render to texture dialog box. Inside here is kind of a confusing looking menu, but what we're truly going to do, we're going to go ahead and select the crate here, and it should show up in the Objects to Bake list menu here. Inside this list menu, we've got a lot of options, but we're going to focus only on a few of them in here for the moment. As long as the box is selected, it'll show up in this list here. Underneath, we've got the Select Object settings. Right now, it's enabled, which means if we select them, it'll add it to the list, which is great. We've also got this little padding number. Before, when we broke all those little tiny pieces up, if we don't have any padding at all, you may end up with some black seams or some white seams depending on your final texture. So if we add, I don't know, a couple to these padding numbers, more like 4 pixels to the outside, what it does is take that image and kind of stretch it out so that you don't end up with a seam, but instead you end up with a wood grain looking piece toward the outside, just to cover any accidental display issues. Further down, we're going to skip the projection mapping for now. That has to do a little bit more with high poly to low poly normal stuff we'll get to here in the future. We're going to come down here and we are going to the mapping coordinates, use existing channel, and we want to change that to the channel that we set our unwrap to, Uvw Map channel 2. Down a little further, we have an output list. In this case, we have an add button. We need to go ahead and add what kind of textures we want to create. For this first one, let's go ahead and just add the diffuse color map here, and go ahead and hit the Add Elements button. It's going to add the map to the list. It's going to tell you we're going to create a diffuse map for box 01, and then it'll give you a couple of more bits of information like the size. Currently, it defaults us at 256 by 256 pixels, which is incredibly small. Underneath here, we can change that so that we can make it a little bit different. We've got the choice to select something different for the background. Maybe we want to choose kind of a brown color instead of black, just in case there is any overlap that padding didn't take care of. We can choose the file name and also where to save it and what kind of file type. It defaults us with a default name, box01 diffusemap.targa, but you've got this little browse button here. So that's our next step. We're going to go ahead and click that browse button and find a place to save this baked out rendered texture. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to call it crate_diffuse. And we'll just save it as a JPEG at this point. You know, other image formats might be a little bit better. It's going to depend mostly on what your game engine that you're trying to import this thing is handles the best. We'll just go ahead with JPEG for now because it's easy to show over the internet, and just in case we do this class online and everything, that works out a little bit better. Crate_diffuse, go ahead and hit the save button. I like to turn mine up to best quality and say OK. Underneath here, you've got your map size. You'll notice that the width and the height, they're both set to 256, just like it tells you up here in the output menu. We've got a couple of quick standard buttons here, 1024 by 1024. I'm going to go ahead and select that one because it's a fairly standard game texture size. Might be a little big for a crate, but it ought to work very well for what we're doing. And then we're going to go all the way back down here to the baked material rollout, where what we want to do is put a check mark in this render to files only. Otherwise, it's going to try and screw up your current texturing and do it on its own automatically. So I like to make sure there's a check mark in this box so that we just render a texture and then we do the work ourselves so that we know exactly how and what and where to put all this stuff. Once you've done that, we go ahead and hit the render button underneath. It will compute an image based on those unwrapped UVs. Notice that here are pieces of this crate are all split up just like the unwrapping that we did for the flatten mapping, and it is putting all of the separate graphics and pieces and images and even box tape and burn marks all in their perspective polygons, but it's rendering them out in a single image. The image that we just rendered is what they call a complete map. You'll notice that there's lighting changes, shadow changes, even the specularity and all that stuff is showing up here. Know that this is not the final version that you saved. If we go ahead and minimize this and we go find where else we actually saved that file out to, where we told it to save that crate_diffuse JPEG, and open it up, this is the final diffuse map that it has created for us. You're going to notice that the extra shadows and lighting effects are gone. We've got just the flat diffuse. You'll also see that padding number in effect, where it kind of pushed out a little ways and added some, just kind of stretched that image so that we get some varying colors rather than a black or a dark seam or this just flat brown seam. But it did a very good job now saving this texture out into a diffuse map that we can then import as a single image into a single texture, and from here on out make our lives a little bit easier if we have to import this into different programs such as game engines. Just for good practice here, we can go ahead, come back up to our render to texture here. We can select the output here and get rid of it. We can also add in a couple of other things like maybe a normals map and a specular map, since we had bump information and specular information as well. We'll have to select each one individually, remember, and change the size as well as where and what to save this as. If I change this first one to crate_normals and save it as a JPEG, you'll notice that here it's changed the name, the location it's saving it out to, and the size right there. Then I can select the one underneath, the specular map, make sure I change its size, and also give it the same treatment here, crate_specular, or just spec, and we'll save it as a JPEG as well. Say OK. You can keep adding these depending on what your texturing information contains. If we've got the diffuse, the normals, and the specular all here, we can go ahead and hit render again. It'll spit out something that looks exactly the same as that first image, which is what we call a complete map. And once it's finished, you'll find the brand new normals map and specular map information in that folder that you told it to save to. We'll give this just a moment here to finish because it doesn't take too long. Good. As we told it to save a file already, we don't have to do any extra saving work from this rendered window. We can just kind of close it down, and then what we're going to do is build a brand new texture. Right now we've got the sub-object textures, which work great inside 3D Studio. Say you're just going to render out a final film or an animation. But if we're going to take these 3D models and import them into any kind of real-time rendering engine like a game engine, we need to simplify all of our multi-sub-object texturing. So I'm going to grab the blank texture slot here next door to our multi-sub-object textures. May even give it a name. We'll call it Crate Unwrapped or something. And open up my maps rollout. In the diffuse color, I'm going to go ahead and click that None Channel button, select Bitmap from the list, and find that crate_diffuse that we rendered out. Say Open. You'll notice that it applies that to the sample sphere exactly as it is, etc., etc., etc. We can also add in the same way here under specular level, go to None, Bitmap, load in the crate specular map that we created. Back to parent. Turn this toggle switch on that says Show Shaded Material in Viewport, And the last thing we did is, because we rendered out a normals map rather than just a standard bump map, we'll come into the bump channel here, add in the normal bump first, and then under normal, we can go ahead and select bitmap and find the crate underscore normals that we had rendered out. A little bit of bump information. And then go to parent a couple of times, maybe adjust our bump amount numbers, and we could take a look here. Now we've got all that specular information, the diffuse information, and a little bit of that bump information as well. Over on our model, before we go ahead and apply this thing here, we've got our Uvw Unwrap modifier here set up with these UVs unwrapped the way we want them. We've also got this Uvw Map traditional modifier, which worked very well with our multi-sub-object textures, but will no longer help us at all now that we've flattened these textures out into a single image. So we're going to come down in the stack, go ahead and click on that Uvw Map. A warning will pop up. Just say hold/yes. And then now that the Uvw Map modifier here is selected, go ahead and hit the Remove Modifier from the stack button, the little trash can button here, to get rid of it. We can then move up in the stack, take a look at our Unwrap Uvw textures modifier, come back down to where we did that map channel. Let's just put that right back to 1, and then again say move when it gives you a warning. It'll initially look like your crate gets all messed up because, remember, it's still got the multi-sub-object textures attached to it. However, if we assign our newly unwrapped texture to it, it will take over from that original map channel using our unwrapped UVWs, and all of our information now is being read from a single standard shader with a single standard image for diffuse, specular, and bump all the way around. That is how our render to texture window works. In order to take this idea just a little bit further, we can go ahead and do a similar idea for a whole lot of different things. Other things including lighting, stuff that maybe video game worlds and engines will not handle, where we can use fancy renderers like mental ray lighting and everything, where you might take this into Unity where mental ray does not exist. So we'll render to texture even lighting effects. In order to show you this real quick here, we've opened up the lighting experiment we did with the sort of office waiting room thing in another lesson. We used mental ray and the daylight system and photometric lights and standard lights and some other things to light up both an interior and an exterior kind of lighting setup here. We've got lots of fancy lights going on in here, including daylight systems, photometric light bulbs, ambient light sources, things that not a lot of game engines either can process, nor would they be able to process quickly. For us, if we hit the render button, we have to end up sitting here and waiting for quite a lot of time in order to get that final image kind of spit out with all of that beautiful lighting and shadows and reflective light sources and all those colors that are being bounced around the room with the final gather and all that good stuff. This is something that just will not happen in a game engine, right? We need it to render instantly. It's a real-time renderer. So we're going to go ahead and use our render to texture window to fake or give the illusion that all of these lighting effects that have happened here inside this room can be baked into a texture that same way that we just did the crate. Inside our scene here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do this and apply it just for the walls, floor, and ceiling, which happen to be one and the same model. If I go ahead and I select one of these objects, which happens to be our walls, and I move it around, right, all the little things like the lighting fixtures and the chairs and stuff like that, those will not come along with it. But overall, we've got this this ready to go that we can, apply a lot of this great things like these shadows and some of this reflective light and all this great stuff that we did with our lighting experiment. And we're going to render it into a texture. Just like we just did with the crate, a little bit more complex of an idea here, but it's the same one. On top of this, we'll see that we've got a Uvw map already. It's simply a planar map for this one in this case. Edit poly and then a shell modifier to make the walls a little thicker. On top of all of it, we're going to add again that Unwrap Uvw modifier. As this uses very simplistic ideas from our Unwrap, we're going to go ahead immediately and open up the Uvw Editor. If I zoom out, we'll be able to see kind of a top view almost of this UVs as it's set up now currently with just that planar mapping. If that mapping was set to something else like box, we might have some more detail on the walls, but the walls are just flat color and all that stuff anyway. So again, back into our Unwrap Editor, we're going to go ahead and select our polygons. I want to make sure over here that the ignore backfacing is turned off. And I'm going to drag a selection around all of them, hopefully selecting everything in the room that's part of this object as that red polygon highlight. From here, just like we did our crate, we're going to go up to the Mapping and Flatten Mapping from the Mapping menu. Leave everything default and just say OK. What that does is repack that as well as unwrap that and flatten everything out into separate seamed UVs here for us, fitting them all into a single image plane automatically. Again, if we were doing this professionally, we might take some time and make sure that some of these smaller little pieces might be welded together with on the whole overall. With some of the larger pieces, we might do some cleanup here, but for this demonstration, this will work just fine for us. So we can immediately kind of go ahead and close the editor, turn off our sub-object, and continue on. As is, we've got our Uvw Map channels down here at the bottom, which was already number 1. So for the UVWs here, we're going to go ahead and change the map channel to 2, and go ahead and say move, just like we did with that crate as well. Then we can move into our rendering menu and our render to texture. Remember, the hotkey for that is 0, so I can just hit 0 on my keyboard to bring up that render to texture window. Inside here, I want to make sure, again, I've got my walls selected so that they appear in the Objects to Bake list. We can go ahead and give them a padding, a little bit extra padding if you like. It defaults us with 2. Would probably work okay, but I bump mine up to 4 just to be on the safe side. Again, we're gonna skip the projection mapping. That's something different we'll get to in another lesson. And come down here to the mapping coordinates. We want to use existing channel and change that to 2. Which is what my Unwrap is currently set for, just so that it doesn't get confused as to which UV modifier it's talking to. Down a little further into the output, we're going to go ahead and hit that Add button, and this time we've got an option here that we want to choose. The very, very top one says Complete Map. You've also got some other things in here, things like a lighting map, a shadows map. The Complete Map kind of encompasses everything that it can here, from shadows to light to occlusion, everything. So let's select that complete map and go ahead and hit the Add Elements button. It'll add it to our output list. Again, it defaults us with a very small size that's just not very good for games nowadays, which have more processing power. So we'll come down here and make some settings changes. First of which, I may bump this up to, since it's an entire environment, maybe I'll go to 2048 to make this one fairly large so that the resolution's a little bit better. And then the file name and type, I'll go ahead and select that Browse button and find a better place to save this. And we can call it Office Waiting Room, and then Complete Map. And we'll save that as a JPEG and go ahead and hit Save. Okay, after I move my settings all the way to best so we get a good quality result, and scroll down once again, make sure that Render to Files Only box is checked, and then go ahead and hit that Render button. What it's going to do now is calculate, just as it would a regular render, all of the lighting effects, the shadows, the outside color from the blue sky on down to the warm sunlight, all the way around this room, and it's going to put those lighting effects, including the shadows of, let's say, some of our chairs, or the highlights from our fluorescent bulbs in the fixtures, all over this place, and it's going to add these lighting effects to the texture itself, which means later on we can save this texture map out and import it into a game where we will give the illusion, as we run through this office building in a game world, that all of these wonderful, highly advanced rendering techniques for lighting can get used even in something that needs to render instantly. We'll go ahead and give this a minute to finish. It'll take a little bit longer because it is now calculating lighting effects. And then we'll take a look at what we've done by applying it to the room and getting rid of all the lights in the scene, and we'll see just how well we've done. Okay, so I paused the recording just so you guys didn't have to sit here watching it render for 20 minutes there. But just know that while it does look like it jumped to the end of this rendered texture pretty quickly, that it does take quite a while. Remember, we are rendering all the same lighting effects that we would for an actual finished image. We're just rendering them into separated out texture pieces for this entire room. Our final render here for the complete map is fairly large, and if I zoom in on it, 1-to-1 ratio here, we can see things like the perfect outline shadows of the chairs, occlusion shadows that appear because there's a wall in the way, or some highlighted shadows and stuff like that are all around this room, all over the place, baked right into the texture. Wherever we told this texture to save, which would be right here, you'll have that same image saved out there with your buffer zones, your padding, and all of that good stuff right there for us. So in order to see how this works, let's go ahead and shut this down, close the render to texture window. And what we're going to do is get rid of all the actual lights in our scene. Leave nothing but the default lighting here. If I go ahead and come up to my Select by Name menu here, which is this icon here, it looks like the mouse cursor with a list of what looks like typing, we can open this up and we can sort our list based on what we want to see. If I turn off geometry and shapes and cameras and helpers and groups, leaving only the lights here, I can turn off pretty much everything except just the lights, display lights. Then we can easily select the first one, hold down Shift, select the last one, and get all of them at the same time. Selecting OK, I can go ahead and hit Delete. Those will delete all of our lights in the scene, but remember that your daylight system's not technically a light. It's a system, so it contains lighting elements, but it's not actually thought of as a light. So we'll have to go ahead and select the sunshine icon separately and delete that as well from our scene. At this point, let's go ahead and take our camera view here, our set to realistic, and put it back to shaded, just so that we can see that we are right back to that flat everything. If I do a render here real quick, we'll see that we're still using scene lights, so let's kind of make sure that okay, we're on default lights. One more thing we need to get rid of, hit 8 on your keyboard to open up your environment and effects rollout, because without lights, exposure control is just going to make everything too dark. So if we get back to our environment and effects by hitting 8 on your keyboard, you can also get there by rendering environment. And what we want to do is, under exposure control here, we want to change this drop down back from mental ray photographic exposure control to no exposure control. Now we can go ahead and do a quick render just to see where we're at, which is pretty much back to where we started in the first place when we began to light this whole scene. That being done, let's go ahead and select our walls here, come back over to the side. And what we're going to want to do is kind of come down here to where that old Uvw Map modifier is, select it, the warning will show up, go ahead and hit hold yes, and then we're going to use the little trash can button here, the remove modifier from stack, to delete it. Move back up our stack to the top here, and we can change that map channel now that was set to 2 back to 1, and go ahead and say hit move. Then we're going to open up our material editor. You can hit M on your keyboard to do that. You can also use the button up here. And where we've got all these separate textures and separate things that I multi-sub object and texture this whole room with, we're going to find one of these empty texture slots here. Just a standard texture. And in the diffuse channel, we're going to go ahead and hit that and select bitmap and go find our office waiting room complete map and load it in there. We can hit the go to parent button to back out and make sure that we hit that show shaded materials in viewport button toggled on, so that when we go ahead and take this, click, drag, and drop it onto the room, we're going to change that over. If you get this warning, it says it just means that I was bad and I didn't rename my materials. So we can go ahead and rename this material. We'll call it Complete Map Room or something clever and say OK. And what should happen should be fairly interesting. Right away, all of those lighting effects have kind of returned. or so they look like they've returned. We've still got no light whatsoever in this scene. If I go ahead and hit the render button, however, because we baked all these lighting effects and textures and colors and final gather and bouncing light into the texture itself, notice how fast this is rendering, and yet it still looks like we've got light in the room, when in fact the default 3D Studio light is the only thing lighting up this scene. That's what our render to texture window is really quite capable of, and can do a pretty decent job. You take this into a game engine, and now it looks like we've got all this wonderful shadows and light and environment, ambient, occlusion, all of this wonderful stuff that takes a 3D render a long time to calculate. We can plug into the texture, save it as an illusion, and now we can run around through this office building, and all we have to do is simulate the moving shadows of, say, the characters or anything moving as far as the bad guys or NPCs are concerned at all. Everything else is just an illusion.